No justice, no peace. I'm Janelle.
I'm Khalid.
I'm Alana.
I'm Donnie.
And I'm Angel.
And welcome to DMLK The Take. In this series, we will release a new episode every Thursday where we will discuss the youth's perspective on the minority experience in America. Last week's episode was our second. If you tuned in, thank you. We took a trip back in time to the beginning stages of our journey, and we talked about our trip to the African American History Museum. We interviewed 4 DPS employees to hear them speak about the changes that will be added to the DPS curriculum and their commitment to help dismantle the system oppressing minorities in this country. I don't know about y'all, but I think it's so sad that people are evolving and the world is constantly changing, yet you still see the same things being taught the same way. Is there anything that really stood out to any of you guys in last week's episode?
What really stood out to me was when we talked to Tamara Acevedo about the plans for the future of Black history and DPS. I know for all of us, this has been a really long journey and process with lots of long hours and lots of emotions. But I think we can all agree that it paid off and it was worth it.
You're right. All the work we have done for Black history has really paid off. What stuck out to me the most is in the last podcast is when we talked to the head of the history teachers at DMLK. She basically said that when she went to the museum with all the other history teachers, they took lots of notes on the very first day, and they were already coming back with plans to change the curriculum. She stated that the history teachers realized they weren't really implementing African American history and they had to start doing so.
I was thinking the same thing. It's both upsetting to me and crazy how we as students and our teachers weren't even aware of the huge gap we're missing in our history. This was probably one of the biggest concepts I took from last week's podcast, how many of us have only been taught one side of history. Before this year and without any research of my own, I would have never known about my history. This unquestionably had me upset because I was taught to look up to and praise people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and these founding fathers that didn't even have my best interests.
Honestly, I feel like one of the biggest things that stood out to me was that conversation we had with Ms. Karchner, where she basically spoke about the fact that she did have a similar experience in her education with Black history. She even admitted that what she was taught in school was whitewashed. I just feel like it really put in perspective how the lack of Black history in the education system needs to change.
Yeah, it was definitely weird hearing Ms. Karchner talk about her school experience being whitewashed. That's shocking.
So I'm sure y'all are wondering what is up this week. So this week, we will be taking a look into the truth-deprived curriculum. Last week, we talked about one of the main sources of Black excellence, which is their history. And this week, we'll be getting a first-hand account on what history looks like in a college environment. We will also be getting a look at how race can play a role within classrooms and how that may affect teachers and students.
In today's episode, we will be speaking to Dr. Matthew Jacobson, a professor of African American Studies and History at Yale University. He has authored 7 books about race, politics, and culture in the United States. His research and teachings include U.S. imperialism, immigration and migration, popular culture, civil rights, and the judicial structures of U.S. citizenship, as well as documentary studies and public humanities. Dr. Jacobson, welcome, and thank you for joining us today on The Take.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get started, we have to remind our listeners about our trigger alert. Kalia, can you please read our trigger alert?
If you are not 110% in support of Black Lives Matter, please dismiss yourself. If you are in any sort of agreement with the systemic oppressions this country has inflicted on minorities, please dismiss yourself. And if you are not willing to give every bit of power that the people so undeniably deserve, please dismiss yourself. Because in a few moments, you will witness vast amounts of Black engagement. And if you do not dismiss yourself, then the thoughts, facts, and feelings we are about to share will most definitely dismiss you.
All right, so let's get into it. Hi, Mr. Jacobson.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Let's give the listeners some quick background here. Where are you from, and what are a few things that you would like our listeners to know about you?
I grew up down the road from you all. I grew up in Boulder, lived there until I was 18. I grew up. I grew up with the civil rights movement kind of rolling in the background, but the subject of dinner table conversation every evening. I grew up in a white liberal household, very white suburb in a very white town, but nonetheless, the civil rights struggle was very present as I was growing up. And I think that really shaped me when I went on to college and started studying literature and history. I, from the start, thought of race as being something that was central to the American experience and something that was really important. When I got to graduate school, I started focusing on immigration, but over time have come to study more and more about race in general and African American history most recently.
Thank you for letting us know all of that. I think that it's really cool that since you were younger, you kind of picked up on the idea that knowing about race and the topic of race is really what helps make the world go round. So, Kalia, do you have a question?
Yeah, so as to get started in this episode, I feel like we should help people understand how schools and coursework aid in the perception of history, as well as the effects of it. So I want to jump right in and ask, when and how did you become interested in a career based around race, politics, and culture?
Yeah, you know, I think that I think it was my upbringing in the '60s made me highly attuned to the fact that that race as as an object of study was really important, and that as a feature of our politics, it was central. I was 10 when Martin Luther King was assassinated, so just to kind of situate myself historically. But it's important to say that at that time, these topics were not being taught in schools at all. And I think that even when I was in college, I mean, it's almost shocking to me how little I was taught about, in a formal way, about African American studies, about race, about citizenship, about immigration. Black studies as a kind of institutionalized field in colleges had really just been invented when I was in college. It was established in 1969 in most schools that had it. I was in college in the mid 70s. And it was very easy to go through your 4 years of college and not learn a single thing about African American studies. And that's shocking to me now, but that was just the case. But I came to college with a hunger for it, and that's what I really sharpened, I think, over the years of college and graduate school in particular. There wasn't a ton of work out there in African American studies or Asian American studies or Latino studies or indigenous studies. These were young fields at the time I was in graduate school in the 1980s, but they were exciting fields and really important fields. And when I was in grad school, I just thought, I think the most important and interesting work that was being done on various aspects of race in the United States. And so I wanted to be a part of that, and I wanted to be involved in those conversations.
I feel like that's really interesting how you spoke about how growing up during the era of the civil rights movement, and how even though in school you weren't really traditionally taught about things like African American studies and indigenous studies and race in general. I just feel like that's really interesting, especially in school where we're not right now necessarily learning too much about our own history. But outside of school, we're really interested in it. So I feel like what's being taught in school now really does influence what you do outside of school and what you want to do in the future.
Yeah, no, and I think that, one of the things I did learn in college was that the most important thing about education is not so much the substance that you learn, but the questions that you learn to ask. And I think it's really important that your generation has learned to ask these really tough questions about your own education, and about what the curriculum does or should look like, but also about the substance of the histories that you're being taught. Because for me, I mean, I think that, those absences in my own education, in K through 12, I knew literally nothing about slavery and was never asked to know anything about it. And so there were questions that I just didn't even have the tools to ask when I was in college. And that's been, I think, some of the most exciting part of my own education is expanding my own horizons to the point where you learn how to ask new questions, things that you'd never even considered before. And here I am now, 60 years old, and have just a completely different conception of our nation's history than the one that was handed to me as a student when I was, in my adolescence.
Definitely. That's why it's so important that we have to learn how to ask these questions so we could get our history now instead of waiting to college to just learn our history. But speaking on that, when you were younger, did you ever see yourself being where you are now?
I really did not. I was not the world's greatest student. I think that I was the kid until, all the way through high school. I was the kid who I think most teachers would have described as really smart, but not fully applying myself. And I wasn't turned on by school. It wasn't lighting me up. That for me happened in college, and that was really what turned my life around, was my college experience, what I learned there, but also some of the mentors and teachers that I had, and some of the models that I saw for the first time, models of really committed, interesting, and engaged educators, which I felt I hadn't necessarily seen in my earlier schooling. And that was the point, that it was in college really, and even towards the end of college, that I started to imagine that maybe a life of scholarship and scholarly writing and research and study and teaching would be something that I was capable of, but certainly something I had a passion for.
Definitely. I feel like a lot of people find it interesting when they go into college. They start seeking out more of their education and get really into what they're learning. I feel like that really definitely happens when you get to college and you start reaching that level. Yeah.
And I think that I think if your education is going well, you end up doing things in college that you hadn't even dreamed of, as you were walking in the door as a freshman. I think that, and that's the exciting thing. And that was for me, that was the important thing. And as a teacher now, it's one of the things that I really love. I love just being able to observe students kind of finding their own capacities and their own interests, and then to help them with that.
Definitely. College is a place to grow and learn more about yourself. And speaking on the topic of college, I know that you've taught at both Stony Brook and Yale University, which are both predominantly white institutions. As a white male, what effect do you think teaching African American history has on your students?
I think, it's not as challenging now being a white professor in a field like this as it was maybe when I started out 30 years ago. The world has changed, even though it might not seem to you all that it has changed enough. My own observation is that the Obama years, actually, with a Black president in office, as much as we've learned a lot about the resistance to that and about the kind of white hatred that has bubbled up in our society in the wake of that. But even so, the fact of a Black president made it much easier to teach these topics, because there was, I think, just a readier understanding among students about how and why it was important. So my own career feels like it falls into kind of the pre-Obama years and the post-Obama years in terms of students' expectations and students kind of self-selecting for studying these kinds of topics. It was during the Obama years that, for the first time, a lot of white students started to show up in African American studies classes, and I think that's a really important, good thing. But it is challenging. It's challenging to teach this topic in these kinds of settings, because Well, for a number of reasons. I mean, we're a society that, for the most part, still is not comfortable talking frankly about race. And and so, you know, people bring a lot of baggage into the classroom around those questions. And there's also a huge differential. I mean, students of color have much more experience in general thinking and talking about race, and they tend to be much more sophisticated in their analysis because they've had to be. And white students, you know, part of the way white privilege works is that white students have the luxury of not knowing things a lot and not even knowing that there are things that they don't know, right? So this is the luxury of a kind of ignorance around questions of race that a lot of white students bring into the classroom with them. So it's very challenging because it's diversity in this kind of a classroom setting. It doesn't just mean people from different backgrounds, but it means people who are very differently attuned to a topic and how to think about it, or who feel varying levels of investment in the topic. So that's one of the biggest challenges in managing a classroom like this, and getting everyone involved and getting people to bring their best, getting people to understand what their own contribution can be, and also what their own limitations might be. And it's very challenging to teach that. But it's also very exciting. And I think, you know, as I said, I think it's one of the most important things that a person could study in this country. So I'm really committed to it. The last thing I'll say, though, is Yale is not as white as you might think. It's a very heavy, old white institution. There's no question about it. It comes out of a white history, and it still kind of carries that heaviness of tradition. But the undergraduate admissions department has done just a spectacular job in diversifying our student body over the last 15 or 20 years. And so if you just had a kind of bird's eye view of the student population at Yale, you might be surprised. It's a much more diverse place than it probably would seem from the outside.
Really quick, I just remembered you were talking about how usually kids would come into your classrooms and colleges and they would be more eager they had a lot of questions about race because of the fact that race isn't something that's really talked about, especially before you get to college. And like, I see how that makes a lot of sense because we're living it. Like, you can see that race still is not a topic that's comfortably talked about. But how do you feel like changes, or like the changes that we're trying to help implement right now, will be able to change that? And what do you think that's going to look like in your classroom when you see students that have got those opportunities to talk about race? Like, how do you think that would change?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, you know, the people in my field who are teaching at the college level are just eager for the day when students walk in the door knowing more than they do currently. Because obviously if the baseline of our common kind of collective knowledge is raised, then we're capable of going further and doing more in the classroom. So I think that would be the biggest change, would be we wouldn't have to do like really basic kind of remedial work to get students up to speed, to even just know the basics of how race has operated in American history, you know, and not just slavery, although slavery is a huge example. I think most of our students really know very little about slavery. And they also many of them think that it took place so long ago that it's barely even relevant to the world that they live in. So we spend a lot of time just breaking down, you know, doing really basic work to provide basic knowledge, but also to kind of break down some of the assumptions that students walk in the door with. And it would be a luxury to not have to spend our time that way, and to be able to take the conversation further and to reach higher. I think that the most important thing, though, in kind of thinking about the K through 12 curriculum and the changes and the work that you all are doing, I just so applaud it. I think it's really great what you're pushing for and what you're pushing your teachers and your mentors to take on, I think is so important. I think one of the misconceptions is that African American history is for Black students, or that Latinx studies is for Latinx students. And there certainly is some important truth to that. I mean, I think that, you know, and some of you have expressed that, you know, learning about myself, learning my history, and that possessive pronoun, my, I think is really important, and we should never lose sight of that, and we shouldn't lose sight of where we each stand in relationship to these histories. But at the same time, I would really just stress that if you don't know African American history, you don't know American history. I mean, all you can do is misunderstand American history if you don't have a solid grounding in African American history, because there are so many aspects, not just of the African American experience, but of the American experience writ large, that can only really be comprehended and covered with that kind of inclusive frame that takes in, you know, all of the peoples who make up the complicated history of this country. So it's not as though, you know, there's this thing called American history and then African American history as an add-on. It's that once you fold the two together, they both look completely different. And I think that that's the misunderstanding. I think that educators like some of the great teachers who you're working with to change your curriculum, I think they often find themselves kind of swimming upstream because there are so many people in K through 12 education who assume that you can teach American history without teaching African American history. And so, and that's a misconception that we just have to still keep working on.
I feel like in your answer, you said a lot of really important things. Like that first question we asked about how like a lot of white students, they feel like, well, I feel like just most non-Black students, they come into it thinking that slavery was so long ago and that doesn't really have anything to do with the world today. But a lot of the systems in place today and just how Black people are treated across the board really do stem directly from how we were treated back in slavery. I also feel like one really important thing that you said that I'm trying to reconnect is like, right now, especially in this day and age with like our new civil rights movement and like Black Lives Matter still progressing, a lot of like non-Black people are trying to like learn to be anti-racist and like leading back their own like old implicit biases and habits. I feel like while it's important also, it should be the school's job to like kind of already teach them because like as Black students, we know like I don't want to say like all Black students, but like when we interact with other minorities, we know what it's like to have stereotypes pushed on us and how to be treated poorly in society. So we know like we kind of already have that solidarity between us. I feel like it's so important that schools not only teach students like the history of their peers, but also just how to support them, especially at schools like ours where it's minority dominated. You would think more people would know about each other's struggles, but we really don't. And just to kind of go into a different area of the discussion, I want to ask, as a white man, how do you think your decision to study and teach African American history has affected how other white people interact with / treat you?
That's interesting. I think that's also changed over time. I think that I think I'm more legible to white colleagues and white students, but I think probably white people in general in the last 15 years as a white person working in African American studies. Then I think I remember back in the 90s, people treated me like I was an oddity. You know, like it was weird. It was weird that I was teaching African American studies. And I got that from white students. I got that from Black students. I had Black students in my classroom when I was a very young professor who were convinced that there wasn't a single thing that I could teach them. And I understood why they thought that. But then it was just another thing I had to try to overcome in the classroom. I think that is much less likely to happen now, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. But I think that, you know, it's not so uncommon, for one thing, for white scholars to be working in areas like this anymore. And also, I would say, I mean, you know, it's different at different places. I think Yale has a very long history of a really kind of what you call an integrated African American studies department. A lot of white faculty over the years have participated in that department. A lot of white students have studied in that department. So there's a different kind of history at Yale than there might be at other places. But I think the more important thing is that kind of change over time, where you know, these fields, like I said, Black Studies was established in the late 60s. And so you kind of think about in generational terms, there have been, you know, 3 roughly generations of scholars who have devoted themselves to this. And by now, the literature is broad enough and deep enough that, I mean, these are giant fields now. And I think that there's, it's easier for people to understand why one would be engaged in it as a white person.
So I know that you talked about when you were a young professor, you had a Black student or Black students that would come in and feel like there's nothing that you could possibly teach them, right? And like would show that through their attitude or behaviors. And I feel like that I see that a lot in our classrooms. Or like if topics like that were to be brought in our classrooms, I'm pretty sure that'd be something that we'd see as well. Do you feel like that has to do with like distrust at all, or feeling like, you know, why should I listen to you? Do you feel like that at all?
Yeah, I think it can come from a lot of different places. Certainly, distrust would be one of them. That kind of ownership, or that feeling of ownership of a field with your kind of personal stake, I think it's totally understandable why a Black student would think that that he or she had a special relationship to a field that a white professor or a white teacher did not share. And there's truth to that. That doesn't necessarily translate into, you know, you have nothing to teach me. Those are 2 different questions. And that's, you know, and that's just part of the challenge of teaching in general. But, you know, learning how to show students what you have to offer, but also always, I think, being really sensitive to where you are standing in relation to the topic at hand, so that you're never claiming too much, or you're never assuming too much about your about how, you know, how students are going to understand your own investment in these topics. You know, so a lot of it is, for me, it's kind of rooted in book learning, right? If you read 1,000 books on a topic, you're going to know some things that a person who didn't read the 1,000 books isn't going to know. And if you live in that space, you know, like this is my strength. I have a lot of experience with the material. I've been in the archives. I've looked at the documents. I've read the books. I have things to offer an 18-year-old in this field, even though I'm white and she's Black, right? But it takes a few steps, I think, to get students to that point where they're able to see that in you. And I think the distrust, I think, is totally understandable.
I love that you put it that way, and seeing how just, you know, it's literally factual that there's something that you can always teach somebody else, and it really just, it's how you go about teaching them. But yeah. Sorry, Angel, you could go.
No.
Yeah.
The other thing I can just add is that you know, white privilege operates in these spaces too, and there are things that I can accomplish as a white professor that would be much harder for me if I were Black. And it's because, I mean, I can leverage my own white privilege in these spaces, especially with white students, actually. I can leverage my own white privilege to help students see things in a different way that they might have a harder time hearing from a Black professor.
I think it's very important you mentioned that. And I feel like that's something a lot of educators fail to realize, that number one, you need to educate yourself on your students' experiences, but it's not going to be like in the snap of a finger that they're going to ultimately trust you. So as an educator, it should be your job to build that level of trust. And I'm glad that you acknowledge that. But I want to move into some of your work that you've done. Mm-hmm. So for your book, The Historian's Eye, it started out as a website in which you conducted interviews, you incorporated visuals, and altogether provided multimedia resources. How did it evolve into becoming a book?
This project, it kind of unfolded in a few different stages over almost 10 years. It started with the first Obama inauguration in 2009, and that was really that day, the day of the inauguration, when I was starting out, was all it was going to be. I went to the National Mall, I went there for the inauguration, I shot hundreds of photographs, I interviewed some people, and I didn't even know exactly what I was going to do with that material, but it was that day that was most interesting to me. And then I just stayed with it because that historical moment kept being interesting. It was, Obama was a really interesting figure. The way that the society responded to Obama was really interesting. Over time, it became more and more troubling, and the opposition to him got fiercer and fiercer. But there was also a huge amount of pride in him, and there was a hunger. Definitely a pride among people of color, and it was just palpable. But even among white people, there was a real. I think people saw it as an opportunity to kind of reinvent ourselves as a nation. It's like, wow, we're a country that could elect a Black president, and so maybe that means something about who we are that we hadn't known before, and we can start telling ourselves different stories about ourselves, right? And so I remained interested in the responses to Obama, so I kept doing the documentary work. I traveled around, I took pictures, I interviewed people. And then it became about the economic crash, and it became about the Tea Party, it became about the Occupy movement, and it spanned about 6 years of the field work. I launched the website first. I did a gallery show at one point, which was almost like a rough draft of the book. And then, sometime around 2015 or so, I started thinking that I did want to turn it into a book. And so I started the process of selecting my favorite photographs. I chose 100. And then I wanted to write a little essay to go with each one. So the book as it came out is 100 photographs and 100 short essays. And the essays are very different, and each one is its own thing. But the idea for that came to me probably about, I guess in around 2015 probably, and the book came out in 2019.
I feel that Obama has really been inspiring to a lot of people, like moving throughout his years of being president. A lot of people started to look up to him and be like, oh, if we really can elect a Black president, then a lot of things can move forward. We're getting past a lot of the stuff that is happening. But more into when you were talking about your book, The Historian's Eye, do you have a specific book writing process when you begin your research, or does it vary each time?
Each project presents its own problems and prods you towards its own solutions. So that project was a departure for me because it really was a documentary project. It started out with camera in hand and tape recorder and just kind of going out in the world and taking photographs and thinking about them and interviewing people. And that's not normally how historians work. It is a historical book in the sense that what I wanted to do in the book was think historically about the present, which is a different kind of work that historians can do. I wanted to make the point that, I think we're too often taught that history is behind us. It's something that we've left behind us somehow. And what I wanted to do was kind of make the case that it's more like history is the ground that we're standing on. It's more like geology. It's like these outcroppings of rock, and that history is really what the present is made of. And there's nothing here around us that wasn't created historically somehow. And so I wanted to, in The Historian's Eye, it's all about the present, or about what was then the present in the Obama years, but it's kind of a deep dive into the history that created that present. That was the idea. Other books that I've done have been more archival, and some of them come from things I found in the archive, and the discovery came first and the idea came later. Other books, you have the idea first and then you go out and kind of do all the research to figure it out. So each project is its own thing, but that's one of the things I love about what I do. I feel like one of the luckiest people in the world because my job allows me to reinvent myself every day and do something new and try for new things and experiment, both in my teaching, but also in my research. So each project is very much its own thing.
I like that you mentioned that concept of thinking historically about the present and how, at a certain times like this that we're going through right now, it's going to be written in history books and someone's going to have something to write and say about it. So I think that's really interesting, especially how like you bring a new ideology into all of your books, like how in your book, Whiteness of a Different Color, you talk about how race resides in politics and culture, not nature. Why do you feel as if this theory is important?
I think that the power of race is that it presents itself to us as though it is a feature of the natural landscape. Of course, right? There's clouds, there's rocks, there's trees, there's white people, there's black people. Like it seems that self-evident. But then when you start really looking at it closely, it changes because you realize how changeable race is over time. So someone who's read as a black person in one setting might not be read as a black person in another setting, or over time. So like in the 19th century, there was a category, there were these, categories like mulatto and quadroon that were these like really precise or pretended to be precise calculations of racial mixture. And those were really important distinctions in the 19th century, and people saw them, people recognized them, they got written into law. Like if you were a quadroon, there were certain things you could do that you couldn't do if you were a mulatto, right? They were really important, but then they disappeared. Like nobody is seeing or thinking that way, a century and a half later. So the changeability of race, I think, is really important in recognizing just what racial thinking is doing kind of with us and to us as we look at the world. I think, race has become written into our social reality so deeply that we can't just wish it away. We can't, to say that race is socially constructed is not to say that it doesn't exist at a certain level, because it's made itself real. It's made itself real in law. It's made itself real in, housing policy and banking practices and discrimination and all kinds of things. So it's not to say that race is socially constructed is not to just like try to disperse it as though it's unimportant, but it is to recognize that there's a certain amount of effort that goes into constructing it and maintaining it, and that it is actually a fabrication on the part of a society, and that it's a fabrication that it's meant to serve certain purposes for certain people. And I think when you start looking at race that way, rather than as just a feature of the natural landscape, it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. There are all kinds of questions you can start asking that you can't ask or wouldn't occur to you to ask if you just took it on faith as a kind of natural phenomenon.
I feel like something really important that you said that we should kind of put a spotlight on is the fact that while race as a topic is socially constructed, I feel like in the past there have been certain forms of pseudoscience where like they've tried to justify things like discrimination. I remember before we were actually talking about on one of our later podcasts that we're going to upload, we're talking about how like there used to be diagnoses for things like, I forgot what it's called, but basically like runaway slave syndrome. Like they tried to like describe wanting to run away from slavery as an illness. It kind of shows how in the past, like especially in positions where Black people weren't allowed to have a part in certain sciences or the medical field, like it kind of shows how without representation people can kind of force their own beliefs and try to make it a form of science when today it's really just nonsense.
Right. No, and this is, yes, and this always loops back to what we were talking about before about the nature of our education, because if you're not alerted to the ways that these things work, then you can only be victimized by some of the lies that people are telling you, right? I mean, this is a good education is like, will keep you on your guard because you'll know certain things. So I think, discrimination, I think is a really good example that as a society, we could have a completely different kind of conversation than the one we're currently having about racial justice if certain things were common knowledge. Like if it was common knowledge how housing policy in the 1930s and 40s really created kind of segregated suburbs and whites only neighborhoods. And like that was by design and it was engineered. If everybody knew that and everybody knew the consequences of that, as a society, we could have a totally different conversation about discrimination and what it means and its remedies. But if 75% of the population is totally ignorant about the facts, then you spend all your energy just trying to teach people the facts and you don't get to the more important work of actually having the conversation.
All right, so based on your work and research, I can see you're really big on this ideology of living history. So with that in mind, what are some important factors that 20 to 30 years from now you would want to write about concerning today's political climate?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that I would say a couple of things. I mean, we don't know how important this past 2 months or so in the BLM movement are going to be in the long run. Like at the moment, it seems momentous. It seems like it's really, really important that people took to the streets and stayed in the streets for whatever it's 72 days or something, and that it was white people alongside people of color, and that new kinds of coalitions were formed, and a kind of robust civic engagement was expressed. It seems huge, and I hope it is, but I don't think we really will know in the long run what it means until we get a little bit further down the road. But I do think that once we're further down the road, regardless of what ends up happening, tomorrow or next month, the further out you get from a historical moment, the easier it is to see certain things about it. So even now, I think it's easier to look back at the Obama years and see in them the roots of the Trump years. At the time, Obama, it was like so exciting. It was just like people were just beside themselves with jubilation, and understandably so. But the backlash against Obama was really fierce and really ugly. And in that kind of rolling tide of white resentment against him, you could see the rise of something like Trumpism. Although at the time it was really hard to see, but now we can kind of see it. And I think that 50 years from now, historians will look back and they'll see the Obama years and the Trump years very much as paradoxical as it seems, and as different as those two leaders are. I think historically people will be seeing the Obama years and the Trump years as of a piece. Similarly, I think that when people look back, what seemed to come out of nowhere after Ferguson, between Ferguson and the Michael Brown shooting about 5 years ago, and the George Floyd murder this summer, it seemed like it came out of nowhere, like all of that energy and all that activism. But I think that, again, as we get further out from it and have a better kind of retrospective view of it, it will become clear where that came from and how long in the making that actually was, and that there are all kinds of forces at work, and that there was an infrastructure that was being laid in 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different people that would find expression in the post-Ferguson moment, but that was actually something that had been a much longer range kind of political project. I don't know if that answers your question.
It did answer it.
So from what I understand, you started researching the effects of the pandemic and observing how they will impact policies that educational institutions are putting in place for the upcoming school year. Based on your work, what would your hopes be for policy changes and what would be highlighted?
Yeah, well, Yeah, this is another project. I mean, I just have a little file on my laptop desktop um, that I've just started collecting materials, and it's just called the COVID Project. And I have no idea where I'm going with it or what it's going to be, but it feels really important to do. In policy terms, I mean, I just think it's so obvious that we need leadership from the top. We need a national strategy. We need, I mean, it's all the things we talk about every day as we talk about the upcoming election. You know, where our country is suffering from this, unlike any of our industrialized peers, simply because of the leadership that we've had on this question. So I think the policy concerns really have to do with kind of top-down leadership and coming up with a national strategy that will help get the disease under control. I think we have to depoliticize it. I mean, it's perverse that people are fighting over the meaning of wearing masks when actually it's like it's gonna save us, you know. When it comes to things like my own institution, Yale, and your institution, and thinking about school reopening, you know, I worry. I worry that we're not being as thoughtful as we need to be. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do here locally in my work around the university is to just make sure that you know, we are going to reopen. We know that, and some of the learning will be done remotely. Some of it will be done in classrooms. Here at Yale, we're kind of adopting a hybrid model that's probably not unlike things that are happening all over the country. But I think there are 1,000 things to think about, and 1,000 things to be ready for, and 1,000 things to try to predict and get out in front of. And so that's where a lot of my work is in thinking through the administration of this crazy moment that we're in, and how we can best handle it. I know that, and I sense that this is the case in the schools in your district as well, that one of the things that's happening in the institutional politics of all of this is that decisions are being made, in your case, like at the district level, or in my case, like in the president's office. But how people are actually going to have to live with those decisions is going to be like way down the food chain at the bottom. It's like the facts on the ground, right? So the president decides, you know, here's our quarantine policy, here's what we're going to ask students to do, and all this stuff. And it might sound thoughtful, but by the time you trace it down to the ground, to the actual people who have to carry these things out, it's an enormous heavy lift, and 1,000 things have yet to be worked out. And I think that's one of the vulnerabilities, and I think that we need stronger kind of conversations that don't run from the top down, but run from the bottom up as we think these things through.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I also feel like, because as we know, Black and Brown communities, we are being hit the hardest, maybe because we have more family members in the home, or most of us have to work to get income, and it's very easy to spread COVID, especially in our situations. And just to kind of feed into what you talked about earlier with the district, recently ours and across the country with districts, there's a sudden urge to represent and adhere to the needs of Black students. How do you think the sudden support of the Black community reflects how schools treat their students of color when it does and doesn't benefit them?
Yeah, I think that this is, if I'm understanding your question, I mean, I think that we still live in a highly segregated society, and that's maybe nowhere clearer than in our neighborhoods and our schools. It's also clear in our boardrooms and in all sorts of places, but we live in segregated neighborhoods for the most part, and we attend segregated schools for the most part. And I do think that while the excuse that will get white supremacists off the hook is to just say, well, this is the economics of it, and this is just the way it is. There's rich schools and there's poor schools, and this is how it works out. But all of that was by somebody's design, you know, a few generations back. And it's another of those areas where we really need to understand the history, to understand what it is that we're facing right now. And I think COVID has brought so much of that to the fore. I mean, as you were saying, like, who's who's most vulnerable, and the groups who are really on the front line of the disease because they're on the front line of the necessary work of the society. These are public health issues, but they really do boil down to civil rights and social justice issues in ways that we have to get much sharper in discussing and confronting. And I think that the disparities between schools in a district, or the disparities between districts in a city, are just they're kind of flashpoints and examples of the many ways that the rampant and rife inequalities of our society reverberate, outward in a lot of different ways. And yeah, I don't know if that answered your question or not.
I feel like it definitely did. And just to start wrapping up, I have one final question for you. And just before I get into that, I feel like obviously you're very educated on just race and politics in general. And I feel like a lot of teachers and educators across the board could really learn from not only your experience, but just from the personal work you've done in your field. So I just want to ask, what would you say to teachers who are uncomfortable with the idea of teaching African American history?
That's a great question. And I think, again, I can be empathic. I can understand the challenges and maybe the timidity that a white teacher might feel in taking up a unit or a class on African American studies, or Asian American studies or whatever. On the other hand, the same teacher might feel totally comfortable teaching the ancient Greeks, even though they were never in ancient Greece and they weren't an ancient Greek themselves, right? Or teaching Elizabethan history and, Elizabethan England. The same questions might apply, but they don't, because those aren't as kind of socially fraught. But I think teachers should really pause over that and think about that. Why would I think that, I have more right or more comfort in teaching Elizabethan England than I do in teaching the Harlem Renaissance? Like, why would that be? That makes no sense. So I would just urge people to, to take the courageous step to really question their own reluctance and to challenge it and know that, look, none of us, if we're educators, we're in this because we believe in book learning. And if you believe in book learning, then you can find your way through any topic. You just can. When I was just out of graduate school, I remember thinking, man, if I can teach about the Great Depression, anybody can teach about anything, because I felt like my knowledge there was not very deep. It's gotten deeper over the years, but at the time I just felt, man, how am I going to stand up in front of a lecture class and talk about the Great Depression? But I did. And I think, educators just have to kind of take the wisdom of their own experience and the courage of their convictions and teach these topics, even if they feel ill-equipped or nervous about it, because these topics are crucial. And it's absolutely imperative that as a society, we educate ourselves in these areas in ways that we haven't yet.
Mr. Jacobson, I just want to say thank you so much. I feel like a lot of educators really should have your mindset, because just hearing you speak about your education and educating others, just you as an educator, is really inspiring for me, because it's like I found a lot of passion in just with this podcast and the research that we've been doing as well. And I feel like, as you were saying with reading books, like if you just immerse yourself in the knowledge and stuff, your passion is gonna grow and it's gonna push you to want even more and do even better. And I feel like education, or with the topic surrounding race and politics and everything like that, it's so important. And I feel like when people like us are able to be inspired by that, it's able to make the changes that we've been able to get, and other people are able to see that these changes can be made. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you. And I just want to applaud what you all are doing. I've a couple of times in our conversation today, I've mentioned the establishment of Black Studies as a field in universities in the late 60s. That came out of student agitation. Like, that wasn't any college president's idea. That came from students demanding that the curriculum be changed. So you're part of a long tradition, and a really great one. And I think what you're doing is really important, and I'm very impressed by you all.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, y'all. So on today's episode, we got to see directly through the eyes of an educator and take a dive into some of his work to help us understand how race, politics, and racism all play a role in education. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of No Justice, No Peace, DMLK's The Take. We hope this episode allows you to see how big of a difference culturally responsive, dedicated, and responsible educators make within the education system for students everywhere. Here's our call to action. We ask that you not only identify any injustice you face within your education, but that you take action for what's being taught at your school or your children's school. Your history matters. Your history is real, and it deserves to be taught and acknowledged.
If you enjoyed today's take, make sure you tune into our next episode on Thursday, August 13th at 4 p.m., where we'll be discussing Healing Wounds 400 Years in the Making, featuring our very own trauma-certified social worker, Ms. Pamela Vaughn, our social worker, Sydney Hawks, and our school nurse, Ms. Felicia Hawkins.
You can follow us on our Facebook page, No Justice, No Peace, DMLK's The Take, and email us at dmlksthetake@gmail.com.
Make sure you give us your feedback through our social media on what you think our last 3 episodes should be about, and contact us for a chance to be on the show and give us your take.
Thanks, guys. Make sure to tune in today.
Thank you.
Thank you.